The sound of the gavel struck like thunder in the dusty auction square of Pinos Altos, New Mexico, in the summer of 1872. As Grace Zimmerman stood trembling on the wooden platform, her wedding ring catching the harsh sunlight, the last remnant of a life that had crumbled beneath her feet just days before. The crowd that had gathered for the auction was unusually large for the small mining town. Men in dusty hats and women in plain dresses stood beneath the merciless sun, fanning themselves as they eyed the merchandise being presented. Some were there to buy, others simply to witness the spectacle. The auction square was situated just off the main street, surrounded by wooden buildings with peeling paint saloons, general stores, and the sheriff's office, which remained conspicuously quiet during these proceedings. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to meet the evaluating gazes that crawled over her like insects. Her blonde hair, once neatly pinned, now hung in loose strands around her face. Her dress, once fine, was smudged with the evidence of her journey. But it was the gold band on her finger that seemed to mock her most, a cruel reminder of promises broken, and a husband who had abandoned her to this fate. Next up, a fine young woman from back east, the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the square. Strong constitution, educated, can read and write. Would make a fine housekeeper or companion. Grace winced at the words, companion. Everyone knew what that meant in these parts. The bidding began at $20, a price that made her stomach turn. She had been worth so much more just a week ago, a respected school teacher with a husband and dreams of a family. Now she was being sold to pay off her husband's gambling debts, debts she hadn't even known existed until the creditors came knocking at their door in the dead of night. $25, called a gruff voice from the crowd. $30, countered another man, a prospector with yellow teeth and hands stained black with silver ore. $50, came a new voice, deep and clear. A murmur swept through the crowd as people turned to look at the newcomer. Standing at the back, tall and imposing, was a man Grace had never seen before. His face was partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but she could see the strong line of his jaw, covered in a neatly trimmed beard. Unlike many of the miners and townspeople, his clothes, though dusty from travel, were of good quality, a black vest over a white shirt, dark pants tucked into well-worn boots. The auctioneer's eyes lit up at the unexpected high bid. $50 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 55? The prospector who had bid 30 spat on the ground. 55. $100. The stranger countered immediately. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. $100 was a small fortune in Pinos Altos. Going once, the auctioneer called, unable to hide his excitement. Going twice. No one dared to counter. Sold. To the gentleman in the back for $100. Grace felt her legs go weak beneath her. She had been sold, like cattle or a piece of furniture. The reality of it hit her with crushing force, and she swayed slightly on the platform. The stranger approached, his spurs jingling softly with each step. As he neared, she could see his eyes clearly for the first time, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. He nodded to the auctioneer and handed over a small pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. Papers all in order, the auctioneer said, passing a document to the stranger. She's all yours, mister. The stranger tucked the paper into his vest pocket without looking at it. Instead, he gazed up at Grace, his expression unreadable. Come down from there, madam, he said quietly. With as much dignity as she could muster, Grace descended the steps of the auction platform. Her legs felt numb and she stumbled slightly on the last step. A strong hand caught her elbow, steadying her. Thank you, she murmured automatically, the politeness ingrained from her Eastern upbringing surfacing even now. "Name's Wyatt Jackson," the man said, releasing her arm once she had found her footing. "And you are?" "Grace Zimmerman," she replied, surprised by the courtesy of the question. Most buyers didn't care about names. "Mrs. Zimmerman, by the looks of it," Wyatt observed, his gaze dropping to the gold band on her finger. Grace instinctively covered the ring with her other hand. "Yes," she admitted, a flush of shame coloring her cheeks, "though I imagine that doesn't matter much anymore." Wyatt studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "It matters if you want it to matter," he said finally. "Come on, my horse is this way." He turned and began walking toward the edge of the square, clearly expecting her to follow. Grace hesitated, suddenly afraid. What had she been sold into? What did this man want with her? As if sensing her thoughts, Wyatt paused and looked back. "I'm not going to hurt you, Mrs. Zimmerman." "You have my word on that." There was something in his voice, a steady certainty that made her believe him, at least enough to follow him across the square. The townsfolk watched their passage with curious eyes, whispering behind their hands. Grace kept her gaze fixed on Wyatt's broad back, refusing to acknowledge their stares. At the hitching post stood a magnificent Palomino horse, its coat gleaming like gold in the afternoon sun. Beside it was a sturdy mule laden with packs. "This is Sundown," Wyatt said, patting the horse's neck. "Best horse I've ever had." Grace nodded, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected introduction. Wyatt untied a canteen from his saddle and offered it to her. "Drink. It's hot today." Grace accepted the canteen gratefully, suddenly aware of how parched she was. The water was cool and sweet against her dry throat. "Thank you," she said, handing it back. "Can you ride?" Wyatt asked, adjusting one of the packs on the mule. "Yes," Grace replied. "Though it's been some time." Wyatt nodded. "Good. We've got a ways to go before nightfall." "Where are we going?" Grace asked, unable to keep the apprehension from her voice. Wyatt paused in his preparations. "My ranch is about half a day's ride from here. We'll stop for the night at Walker's Creek, then continue on in the morning." "Your ranch," Grace repeated. She had expected to be taken to a saloon or a miner's shack, not a ranch. "It's nothing fancy," Wyatt said, misinterpreting her surprise. "But it's comfortable enough." He finished checking the mule's packs and turned to her. "I'm going to help you up," he said, his hands hovering near her waist. Grace nodded her consent, and Wyatt lifted her easily onto Sundown's back. The saddle was not designed for a woman in skirts, but she managed to arrange herself as modestly as possible. Wyatt mounted behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around her for the reins. "Hold on to the pommel," he instructed. And then they were moving, the horse's gait smooth and sure as they left the auction square behind. As they rode through the main street of Pinos Altos, Grace felt the stares of the townspeople follow them. She kept her head high, though inside she was a storm of confusion, fear, and humiliation. What kind of man bought a woman at auction only to put her on his own horse and treat her with courtesy? What did he want from her? They passed the last buildings of the town and emerged onto the open trail that wound through the pine-covered hills surrounding Pinos Altos. Only then did Grace allow herself to relax slightly, the tension in her shoulders easing as the sounds of the town faded behind them. "You're probably wondering why I bought you," Wyatt said suddenly, his voice close to her ear. Grace stiffened again. "I assume you had your reasons, Mr. Jackson." "I did," he agreed, "but maybe not the ones you're thinking." When he didn't elaborate, Grace turned her head slightly to look at him. "What reasons then?" Wyatt's expression was serious, his blue eyes steady on the trail ahead. "I don't hold with selling people," he said simply. "Never have, saw too much of that during the war. You fought in the war." Grace asked, momentarily distracted from her own predicament. Union sighed. Wyatt confirmed. Saw things no man should see. Promised myself if I lived through it, I'd never stand by and watch a person being treated as property again. Grace absorbed this, trying to make sense of it. So you bought me, to free me. That's the long and short of it, Wyatt agreed. Hope, dangerous and fragile, fluttered in Grace's chest. Then I'm not. I don't belong to you. No, madam, you don't, Wyatt said firmly. Those papers in my pocket say you're free as a bird. I'll hand them over to you when we stop for the night. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes and she blinked them away furiously. I don't know what to say. Thank you seems insufficient. No need for thanks, Wyatt replied. Just doing what any decent man would do. Grace almost laughed at that. Forgive me, Mr. Jackson, but I've seen precious little evidence that decent men are in abundance in these parts. Wyatt was silent for a moment. Fair point, he conceded. Though I'd say that's true of anywhere, not just the West. They rode in silence for a time, the rhythmic sound of hooves on the dusty trail and the occasional call of a bird the only sounds. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, turning the sky to a palette of orange and pink. If I may ask, Wyatt said eventually, how did you come to be on that auction block? You don't seem like a woman who'd find herself in such a situation by choice. Grace's hands tightened on the saddle pommel. No, she agreed softly, not by choice. She hesitated, uncertain whether to share her story with this stranger who had shown her an unexpected kindness. But something in his steady presence behind her, the respectful way he had treated her thus far, made her decide to tell him. I came west with my husband, Thomas, about a year ago, she began. He had grand plans to make our fortune in silver mining. I was a schoolteacher back in Pennsylvania, but I loved him, so I followed him here. The memory of those early days, full of hope and excitement, was painful now. Things didn't go as planned. The mine Thomas invested in yielded little silver and he began drinking, then gambling. Her voice hardened. I didn't know how bad it had become until 3 nights ago, when men came to our house with papers claiming Thomas had borrowed against everything we owned, including me. Wyatt's sharp intake of breath behind her told her everything about what he thought of that. They said he'd fled town, leaving his debts behind, Grace continued, her voice now emotionless as though she were reciting a story about strangers. I didn't believe them at first, but when Thomas didn't come home that night or the next, I knew it was true. He'd abandoned me to pay his debts. I'm sorry, Wyatt said quietly. No woman deserves such treatment, especially from a man who vowed to protect her. Grace touched her wedding ring, the gold now dull with dust. I keep thinking I should take this off, she admitted. But then I think, no, let everyone see what marriage vows are worth to some men. Marriage vows are worth everything to some men, Wyatt countered gently. Your husband's failings aren't a reflection on the institution, just on him. Grace didn't respond, unsure if she believed that anymore. After a moment of silence, she changed the subject. You mentioned your ranch. Have you lived here long? About 4 years now, Wyatt replied, allowing the shift in conversation. Came west after the war like a lot of men did. Worked as a ranch hand for a couple of years, saved every penny. Then bought my own place when old man Cartwright decided to move back east. And you live there alone? Grace asked, then immediately flushed at the presumptuous nature of the question. Forgive me, that's not my business. Nothing to forgive, Wyatt assured her. And yes, I live alone, unless you count the cattle and my dog, Ranger. Had a ranch hand, Miguel, but he left last month to get married. His wife didn't fancy living so far from town. I see, Grace murmured, relief washing over her that she wouldn't be facing an unknown woman's scrutiny or jealousy when they reached their destination. The sun was now touching the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. The air was cooling rapidly, the heat of the day giving way to the chill of a desert evening. "We'll reach Walker's Creek soon," Wyatt said, nodding toward a line of cottonwood trees in the distance. "There's good water there and a sheltered spot to make camp." As they drew closer, Grace could hear the gentle sound of flowing water. The creek was small but clear, running between the cottonwood trees that provided a welcome respite from the open landscape they had been traversing. Wyatt drew Sundown to a halt in a small clearing near the water's edge. "This is where we'll stop for the night," he said, dismounting in one fluid motion. He reached up to help Grace down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Once on the ground, Grace wavered slightly, her legs stiff from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle. Wyatt's hand remained at her elbow until she nodded that she was steady. "I'll tend to the horses first," he said. "Make yourself comfortable. There's jerky in that saddlebag if you're hungry." While Wyatt unsaddled the horse and mule, watering them at the creek before securing them for the night, Grace explored their small camping area. It was a pleasant spot, with soft grass and the cottonwood trees offering protection from the wind. She found a smooth rock near the water's edge and sat down, removing her dusty shoes to dip her feet in the cool creek. The sensation was heavenly after the long, hot day, and for the first time since the nightmare began, Grace felt a moment of peace. The gentle gurgle of the water, the rustle of leaves overhead, and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky combined to soothe her frayed nerves. She was so lost in the moment that she didn't hear Wyatt approach until he spoke. "Found some firewood," he said, setting down an armload of dry branches. "Nights get cold out here, even in summer." Grace quickly withdrew her feet from the water, suddenly conscious of the impropriety of sitting with bare ankles exposed. Wyatt, however, seemed unconcerned, focusing instead on arranging the wood for a fire. "You mentioned having papers for me," Grace asked, pulling her shoes back on. "Right." Wyatt reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document, which he handed to her without ceremony. "These say you're free and clear. No man owns you." Grace unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. It was a simple bill of sale with her name written in the auctioneer's sprawling hand. At the bottom, Wyatt had added a single line: "I hereby release Grace Zimmerman from all obligation and declare her a free woman." It was signed with his strong, clear signature. "Thank you," she whispered, folding the paper carefully and tucking it into her pocket. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Not looking to be repaid," Wyatt said, striking a match to light the kindling he'd arranged. "Though I do have a proposal for you to consider." Grace tensed, her momentary peace evaporating. Here it was the catch she had been waiting for. Seeming to sense her sudden wariness, Wyatt looked up from the fire, which was now catching on the larger branches. "Not that kind of proposal," he clarified, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "I'm offering you a job, Mrs. Zimmerman, a proper one with fair wages." "A job?" Grace repeated, confused. "My ranch needs someone to keep the house in order," Wyatt explained, feeding more wood to the growing fire. "I'm gone most days with the cattle, and truth be told, I'm not much for cooking or cleaning." "You mentioned you were a school teacher, so I reckon you're educated and capable." The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face as he continued. "The position comes with room and board, plus $10 a month. You'd have your own space. There's a small cabin behind the main house that my mother used as a sewing room when she visited. It's private and comfortable." Grace stared at him, trying to determine if he was in earnest. "You want to hire me as your housekeeper?" "If you're interested," Wyatt confirmed. "If not, I'll take you wherever you want to go when we leave here tomorrow. Silver City, maybe, or even back to Pino's Altos if you have friends there." Grace almost laughed at the idea of returning to Pino's Altos, where she had been humiliated on the auction block. As for friends, she had made few since coming west. Thomas had preferred to keep her isolated, she realized now, probably to hide his gambling and drinking. "What exactly would my duties entail?" she asked cautiously. "Cooking, cleaning, mending, the usual household tasks," Wyatt replied, retrieving a coffee pot from one of the mule's packs. "Maybe planting a vegetable garden if you've a mind to. The soil's good near the house, but I've never had the time to tend one properly." He filled the pot with water from the creek and set it near the fire to heat. "In return, you'd have a safe place to stay while you decide what you want to do next. A month, a year, however long you need." Grace considered the offer, trying to see the hidden angles, the potential dangers, but she could find none. Either Wyatt Jackson was the most honorable man she had encountered in the West, or he was far more subtle in his intentions than most. "May I have some time to consider?" she asked finally. "Of course," Wyatt agreed readily. "No need to decide tonight. Now, are you hungry? I've got coffee brewing and some beans and jerky. Not exactly a feast, but it'll keep body and soul together." As they ate their simple meal by the fire, Grace found herself studying Wyatt Jackson more closely. He was not what she would call handsome in the conventional sense, but his features were strong and pleasant. She guessed him to be in his early 30s, perhaps 5 or 6 years older than her own 26 years. The war had left its mark on him. There was a scar along his jawline that disappeared into his beard, and a certain watchfulness in his eyes that spoke of a man who had seen too much. Yet there was also a gentleness about him, evident in the way he moved, the care he took with his horse, the respectful way he addressed her. It had been a long time since a man had treated her with such consideration. Thomas, for all his initial charm, had quickly come to treat her as a possession once they were married. "How many cattle do you have on your ranch?" Grace asked, breaking the companionable silence that had fallen between them. "About 200 head, Wyatt replied, taking a sip of his coffee. "Not the biggest spread around, but it's growing. Got plans to expand next year if the market holds." "It sounds like a lot of work for one man," Grace observed. "It is," Wyatt admitted. "That's why I need to find another ranch hand to replace Miguel. Been asking around, but good help is hard to come by these days." "I imagine so," Grace murmured, thinking of the rough men she had seen in Pino's Altos, miners and drifters, many with a desperate look in their eyes. Not the type a careful rancher would want working his land. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up into the night sky. In the distance, an owl hooted, the sound echoing across the quiet landscape. "I've been meaning to ask," Wyatt said after a while. "What will you do about your husband?" "If he's still alive, you're still legally bound to him, papers from the auction notwithstanding." Grace's hand went to her wedding ring again, a habit she was growing to despise. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me hopes never to see him again. Another part wants answers," Wyatt finished for her when she trailed off. "Yes," Grace agreed softly. "And justice, perhaps, though I doubt there's much to be had. What he did selling me like property, it wasn't right, but I'm not sure it was technically illegal." "It wasn't right," Wyatt agreed, his voice hardening slightly. "Man makes vows, he should keep them." The conviction in his voice made Grace wonder about his own past. "Have you ever been married, Mr. Jackson?" A shadow crossed Wyatt's face. "No," he said after a moment. "Came close once before the war. Her name was Rebecca. We had it all planned out, the wedding, the little house we'd build. Then the war came and I enlisted." He paused, staring into the fire. "She wrote faithfully for the first year. Then the letters stopped. Found out later she'd married a merchant who didn't have to go and fight. Can't blame her, really. 4 years is a long time to wait," with no guarantee I'd come back alive. "I'm sorry," Grace said, genuinely moved by the quiet pain in his voice. Wyatt shrugged, the firelight catching the movement. "It was a long time ago. Sometimes I think it was for the best. The man who went to war wasn't the same one who came back. Rebecca might not have liked the changes." Grace understood what he meant. War changed people. She had seen it in the veterans who passed through Pino's Altos, their eyes haunted by memories they couldn't share. Thomas hadn't thought he had paid for a substitute, something he had never seemed ashamed of, though it had bothered Grace more than she had admitted. "What about you?" Wyatt asked, turning the conversation back to her. "Any children waiting back home?" Grace shook her head, a familiar ache settling in her chest. "No," she said softly. "I wanted them, but it never happened." Thomas said it was just as well children would have tied us down, prevented us from seeking our fortune. She gave a bitter laugh. Now I think he was relieved. Children would have been one more responsibility he wasn't prepared to shoulder. "His loss," Wyatt said simply, and there was such sincerity in his voice that Grace felt tears threaten again. The fire was burning low now, the night having settled fully around them. Wyatt added another log, sending a fresh shower of sparks into the darkness. "We should get some sleep," he said. "Still have a half-day's ride tomorrow." He pulled a blanket from his pack and handed it to her. "You can sleep near the fire. I'll be over there," he added, nodding to a spot several yards away, giving her a respectful distance. "Thank you," Grace said, accepting the blanket, "for everything." Wyatt merely nodded, then retreated to his chosen sleeping spot, leaving her alone with her thoughts by the fire. As she arranged the blanket on the soft grass, Grace considered her situation. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she had met only hours ago, yet she felt safer than she had in months. Wyatt Jackson had already done more for her than her own husband had in the final weeks of their marriage. The offer of employment was tempting more than tempting. It was a lifeline. She had no money, no family in the West, and few skills beyond teaching, which would be difficult to pursue in this remote region. Working as Wyatt's housekeeper would give her time to consider her options, to save some money, perhaps even to build a new life for herself. But could she trust him? Men, in her experience, rarely did things without expecting something in return. Thomas had seemed kind and generous at first, too, before revealing his true nature. Yet as Grace gazed across the dimly lit clearing at Wyatt's sleeping form, she couldn't help but feel that he was different. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet integrity that reminded her of her father, a man who had never broken a promise in his life. With that comforting thought, Grace closed her eyes, allowing the gentle sounds of the creek and the occasional pop from the fire to lull her into the first peaceful sleep she had experienced in days. She awoke to the smell of coffee and the soft sounds of movement nearby. Opening her eyes, she saw Wyatt already up and about, tending the rekindled fire where the coffee pot was once again heating. "Morning," he said when he noticed she was awake. "Hope you slept well." Grace sat up, pushing her tangled hair away from her face. "I did, thank you," she replied, surprised to find it was true. Despite the hard ground and strange surroundings, she had slept deeply, without the nightmares that had plagued her since Thomas's betrayal. "There's water in the canteen if you want to wash up," Wyatt offered, gesturing to where he had placed it near her blanket. "And coffee's almost ready." Grace thanked him and took the canteen to the edge of the clearing, where she could have some privacy. She splashed water on her face, then used a corner of her petticoat to clean her teeth as best she could. The cool water was refreshing, and she felt more human as she returned to the fire. Wyatt handed her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Not much for breakfast, I'm afraid." "More jerky, and I found some hardtack that's only a little stale." "It's fine," Grace assured him, accepting the meager fare gratefully. After going hungry for days before the auction, any food was welcome. They ate quickly, and Wyatt set about breaking camp with efficient movements. Grace helped where she could, rolling up blankets and packing away the cooking implements. "Have you thought any more about my offer?" Wyatt asked as he saddled Sundown. Grace nodded, having come to her decision during the quiet moments of waking. "I'd like to accept if it's still open." "It is," Wyatt confirmed, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Glad to hear it. Ranch could use a woman's touch." Within the hour they were back on the trail, Grace once again seated in front of Wyatt on Sundown's broad back. The day was clear and bright, the landscape opening up around them as they left the sheltered creek behind and rode into more open country. "Your ranch, does it have a name?" Grace asked as they traveled. "Pine Shadow Ranch," Wyatt replied. "Named for the way the pines cast shadows across the valley in the evening. You'll see it when we get there. It's a sight worth seeing." The trail began to climb, winding through rocky foothills covered with scrubby juniper and piñon pines. The air grew cooler as they ascended, and Grace found herself grateful for Wyatt's warm presence at her back. "Just over this ridge," Wyatt said as they neared the top of a particularly steep incline. "You can see the whole valley from here." As Sundown crested the ridge, Grace gasped at the view that spread before them. A green valley lay nestled between rugged mountains, a silver ribbon of creek winding through its center. Herds of cattle dotted the grasslands, and in the distance, at the base of a pine-covered slope, stood a cluster of buildings, a large cabin, several outbuildings, and what looked like a smaller cabin set slightly apart. "Pine Shadow Ranch," Wyatt announced, a note of pride in his voice. "What do you think?" "It's beautiful," Grace said honestly, enchanted by the peaceful scene. After the dust and noise of Pinos Altos, the valley seemed like a sanctuary. They descended into the valley, following a trail that switched back down the steep hillside. As they drew closer to the ranch buildings, Grace could see more details. The main house was larger than she had first thought, built of sturdy logs with a wide porch stretching across the front. A corral stood nearby, currently empty, and a large barn dominated the yard. The smaller cabin she had noticed was set about 50 yards behind the main house, partially sheltered by a stand of pines. A dog's bark echoed across the yard as they approached, and moments later a large black and tan dog came bounding toward them, tail wagging furiously. "That's Ranger," Wyatt said, a smile evident in his voice. "Best cattle dog in the territory and a good guard besides." Ranger circled Sundown excitedly, barking his welcome. When Wyatt brought the horse to a halt in front of the main house and dismounted, the dog immediately jumped up to greet him, nearly knocking him over in his enthusiasm. "Down, boy," Wyatt commanded, though his tone was affectionate as he ruffled the dog's ears. "We've got company." "Mind your manners." He helped Grace down from the saddle, steadying her as her feet touched the ground. Ranger approached her cautiously, sniffing at her skirts. "He won't bite," Wyatt assured her. "Just curious about newcomers." Grace extended her hand, allowing the dog to sniff it. After a moment's consideration, Ranger gave her fingers a gentle lick, apparently deciding she was acceptable. "He likes you," Wyatt observed. "That's a good sign. Ranger's a fine judge of character." "I'm flattered," Grace replied, a small smile touching her lips as she patted the dog's head. Wyatt led the way up the steps to the main house, pushing open the heavy wooden door. "It's not much," he warned as he gestured for her to enter. "Like I said, I've been without help for a while now." The interior of the cabin was spacious but Spartan. A large main room served as both living area and kitchen, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs stood in the center, and a few pieces of simple furniture, a bookshelf, a desk, and an armchair were arranged near the fireplace. Doorways led off to what Grace assumed were bedrooms. The house was relatively clean but clearly in need of a woman's attention. Dust had collected on surfaces, dishes were stacked haphazardly on a sideboard, and the floor could use a good sweeping. "This is the main house," Wyatt explained, setting down his hat on a peg by the door. "My room's through there," he added, nodding to one of the doorways. "The other room I use for storage mostly, though it could be made into a proper guest room if needed." He crossed to a window and pointed out back. "Your cabin is just through those trees. Like I said, my mother used it as a sewing room when she visited, but it has a bed and a small stove. It's snug enough." "It sounds perfect," Grace said, meaning it. The thought of having her own space, separate from the main house, eased any remaining concerns she might have had about the arrangement. "I'll show you to it after we've had something to eat," Wyatt offered. "You must be hungry after the ride." While Wyatt stabled the horse and mule, Grace took the opportunity to explore the main house more thoroughly. The kitchen area was basic but well equipped, with a good cook stove, plenty of cast iron cookware, and a pantry that was surprisingly well stocked with flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples. The storage room Wyatt had mentioned was indeed cluttered with trunks, tools, and supplies, but she could see its potential as a proper room. The main bedroom, which she glimpsed through the partially open door, was neat but austere, a large bed with a simple quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small table by the window the only furnishings. By the time Wyatt returned from the stables, Grace had swept the main room and was heating water for tea on the stove. "You don't need to start work right away," Wyatt said, looking surprised at her initiative. "I don't mind," Grace replied. "It gives me something to do." In truth, keeping busy helped keep her thoughts from straying to Thomas and the humiliation of the auction block. Wyatt washed up at the basin by the door, then joined her in the kitchen area. "I usually eat simple meals," he told her, "but there's plenty of food. The vegetable bin might need checking, though I haven't been to town for supplies in a couple of weeks." Together, they assembled a meal of beans, bacon, and biscuits that Wyatt had stored in a tin. It was simple fare, but filling, and Grace found her appetite returning after days of barely eating. As they ate at the table, Wyatt outlined her duties more specifically. "The house needs a good cleaning, of course. Laundry once a week. There's a wash house out back with a good boiler. Meals are the main thing: breakfast before I head out, something I can take with me for midday, and dinner in the evening." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I want you to know that I meant what I said about this being a proper job. You'll have your privacy and my respect. If at any point you wish to leave, you're free to do so. I'll pay you your wages and help you get wherever you want to go." Grace nodded, touched by his consideration. "I understand and I appreciate it. I'll work hard, Mr. Jackson. You won't regret hiring me." "Wyatt," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be living and working on the same property, we might as well use first names." "Wyatt," Grace repeated, the name feeling strange on her lips after the formality of Mr. Jackson. After they had finished eating, Wyatt showed her to the smaller cabin that would be her home. It was a short walk from the main house, a well-worn path leading through a stand of pines that provided privacy while keeping the distance manageable. The cabin itself was charming, a single room with a small porch facing the main house. Inside was a narrow bed with a clean mattress, a table with 2 chairs, a small cook stove, and a chest of drawers. A braided rug covered part of the plank floor, and curtains that had seen better days hung at the 2 windows. "My mother made those," Wyatt said, noticing Grace's gaze on the curtains. She was handy with a needle. The cabin was her refuge when she visited, said my father, and I were too noisy for her to get any sewing done in the main house. There was fondness in his voice as he spoke of his mother, and Grace wondered about his parents. Are they still living? She asked. Wyatt shook his head. No, father passed during the war, not fighting, but from fever. Mother held on a few more years, but her heart was never strong. She died winter before last. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. It's the way of things, Wyatt replied, though she could see the loss still pained him. She'd be pleased to know her cabin's being used, never did like things going to waste. He crossed to the chest of drawers and opened the top one. There are some of her things still here, linens mostly, and a few dresses she kept for working around the ranch. You're welcome to use anything that fits. No sense in them sitting here gathering dust. Grace approached the drawer and gently touched the neatly folded clothes. That's very kind of you. I didn't bring much with me. I figured as much, Wyatt said. There's a market day in Silver City on the first Saturday of each month. We can ride in then and get you whatever else you need. He moved to the door. I'll leave you to get settled. There's clean water in the bucket by the stove, and extra blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed. Come up to the main house when you're ready, and we can talk more about the work. After Wyatt left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the past few days. From the auction block to this peaceful cabin, her life had taken yet another unexpected turn. But for the first time since Thomas had abandoned her, she felt a glimmer of hope. She opened the drawer again and examined the dresses Wyatt's mother had left behind. They were simple but well made, in practical colors suited for ranch life. Mrs. Jackson had been a bit shorter than Grace, but the dresses could be let down if needed. With careful fingers, Grace removed her own dusty dress, the one she had been wearing since her arrest by Thomas's creditors. It was beyond saving, she decided, examining the tears and stains. One of Mrs. Jackson's dresses, a faded blue calico, seemed the most practical choice for her new duties. The dress fit reasonably well, a bit short at the ankle but otherwise comfortable. Grace found a comb in another drawer and did her best to tame her tangled hair, pinning it up neatly at the back of her head. As she prepared to return to the main house, her hand went to her wedding ring. For a moment, she considered removing it, leaving it and the painful memories it represented behind in this new place. But something stopped her. Not sentiment, certainly not love for Thomas anymore, but perhaps a need for closure that she had not yet found. The ring remained on her finger as she made her way back to the main house, where Wyatt was waiting to show her the rest of the ranch. The following days fell into a rhythm that Grace found unexpectedly comforting. She rose early each morning, lighting the stove in her cabin to ward off the pre-dawn chill before making her way to the main house to prepare breakfast. Wyatt was always up before her, having already tended to the horses and checked on the cattle nearest the ranch buildings. They would eat together at the large table, discussing the day ahead. Then Wyatt would ride out to check on the more distant herds, sometimes not returning until dusk. Grace spent her days cleaning, cooking, and slowly transforming the main house from a bachelor's functional space into a proper home. She found satisfaction in the work and the gleaming surfaces that resulted from her efforts, in the organization she brought to the previously haphazard storage areas, in the meals that Wyatt praised with genuine appreciation. It was honest work, and for the first time in months she felt useful and valued. The smaller cabin became her sanctuary, a place where she could retreat at the end of the day to read one of the books from Wyatt's surprisingly extensive library, or simply to sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and pink. As the days passed, Grace found herself growing comfortable in Wyatt's presence. He was a man of few words, but what he did say was thoughtful and often unexpectedly kind. He never pried into her past beyond what she volunteered, and he shared his own stories sparingly but honestly. She learned about his time in the war, serving with a cavalry unit that had seen action at Shiloh and Gettysburg. He spoke of the comrades he had lost and the horrors he had witnessed, not with drama or self-pity, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the way those experiences had shaped him. In turn, Grace told him about her life before Thomas, about growing up in a small Pennsylvania town, about her years teaching in a one-room schoolhouse, about the dreams she had harbored of creating a school of her own someday. "You could still do that," Wyatt observed one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "There's no proper school in this valley. The ranchers' children have to go all the way to Silver City for schooling, and most can't spare them for that long." The idea took root in Grace's mind, growing stronger in the days that followed. A school here in the valley, it was a dream worth considering. But not yet, she decided. She needed time to heal, to rebuild her confidence, to put the shadow of Thomas and his betrayal firmly in the past. A month after her arrival at Pine Shadow Ranch, Grace accompanied Wyatt to Silver City for the monthly market day. The town was larger than Pino's Altos, with proper streets laid out in a grid pattern and substantial buildings of brick and stone, instead of the ramshackle wooden structures she was accustomed to. The market itself was a bustling affair, with vendors selling everything from fresh vegetables to handcrafted furniture. Grace, with her first month's wages in her pocket, purchased fabric for new dresses, a pair of sturdy boots better suited to ranch life than her worn city shoes, and various household items for both the main house and her cabin. Wyatt, true to his word, kept a respectful distance as she made her selections, offering his opinion only when asked and carrying her packages without complaint. It was in the mercantile, while Grace was examining bolts of fabric, that the incident occurred. "Grace Zimmerman, is that you?" The voice, familiar and unwelcome, cut through the pleasant hum of the busy store. Grace turned slowly, her heart pounding, to face Thomas Zimmerman's business partner, Edgar Lowell. "Mr. Lowell," she acknowledged stiffly, her fingers clutching the bolt of blue calico she had been considering. Edgar Lowell was a small man with ferret-like features and calculating eyes. He had never made any secret of his admiration for Grace, often paying her compliments that bordered on inappropriate when Thomas wasn't present. "Well, this is a surprise," Lowell said, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Last I heard, you were being sold at auction to cover Thomas's debts, yet here you are, shopping for fabric as if nothing happened." Grace straightened her spine, determined not to show fear. "My circumstances have changed, Mr. Lowell. I've found employment." "Employment," Lowell repeated with a smirk. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" Before Grace could respond, Wyatt appeared at her side, his tall frame casting a shadow over the smaller man. "Is there a problem here, Grace?" he asked, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of steel. Lowell's eyes darted between them, a calculating look crossing his face. "No problem at all, just renewing an acquaintance. Edgar Lowell," he added, extending his hand to Wyatt. "I was in business with Grace's husband." "Wyatt Jackson," Wyatt replied, briefly clasping Lowell's hand. "Grace works for me now, keeping house at my ranch." "Does she indeed?" Lowell's tone was suggestive. "Well, Thomas will be interested to hear that. He's been asking after her, you know." Grace felt her blood run cold. "Thomas is here." "In Silver City. Arrived just last week," Lowell confirmed, seeming to enjoy her discomfort. He's got a new scheme brewing, a sure thing this time, he says. Been wondering what became of his wife. Wyatt's hand came to rest lightly on Grace's shoulder, a gesture of support that gave her strength. Mrs. Zimmerman's whereabouts are her own business, he said firmly. If her husband was truly concerned, he wouldn't have left her to be sold to cover his debts. Lowell's expression soured. That's between man and wife, I'd say, not for outsiders to judge. When a man breaks his vows so completely, he forfeits the right to call himself a husband, Wyatt countered, his voice still even but with a dangerous edge. Grace, sensing the tension rising between the men, placed her hand on Wyatt's arm. We should finish our shopping, she said quietly. We need to be back before dark. Wyatt nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on Lowell. You're right. Mr. Lowell, good day to you. As they turned to leave, Lowell called after them. I'll be sure to tell Thomas I saw you, Grace. He'll be mighty interested to know where you're living these days. Grace didn't respond, keeping her head high as she and Wyatt completed their purchases and left the store. Only when they were outside, in the relative privacy of the busy street, did she allow her composure to crack. He'll tell Thomas, she whispered, her hands trembling as she clutched her packages. He'll know where I am. Would that be so bad? Wyatt asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Maybe it's time you faced him, told him what you think of his actions. Grace shook her head, panic rising in her throat. You don't understand. Thomas is unpredictable when things don't go his way, and he'll see me as his property, something taken from him. You're not property, Wyatt said firmly. You're a free woman with the papers to prove it, and even if he comes to the ranch, you don't have to see him. I'll make sure of that. His quiet certainty calmed her somewhat, and she managed a shaky smile. Thank you. I'm sorry to bring my troubles to your door. Your troubles became my concern the moment I bid on you at that auction, Wyatt replied simply. Now, let's get these packages loaded and head home. I don't like the look of those clouds building in the west. The ride back to Pine Shadow Ranch was tense, with Grace constantly looking over her shoulder as if expecting to see Thomas following them. The brewing storm matched her mood, dark clouds gathering on the horizon, promising a violent release of nature's fury. They reached the ranch just as the first heavy drops began to fall, a peal of thunder echoing across the valley as they hurried to unload their purchases and stable the horses. Go on to your cabin, Wyatt urged as the rain began to fall in earnest. I'll take care of the horses and bring your packages over once they're settled. Grace nodded and dashed through the downpour to her cabin, arriving breathless and damp on the small porch. Inside, she quickly lit the lamps and stove, creating a warm haven against the storm that now raged outside. She had just changed into dry clothes when a knock came at the door. Wyatt stood there, rain dripping from his hat and coat, her packages bundled under his arms. Come in, Grace said, stepping back to allow him entry. You're soaked through. It's coming down in buckets out there, Wyatt agreed, setting the packages on the table. He removed his dripping hat but remained standing near the door, clearly aware of the propriety of being in her private space. Grace fetched a towel from the chest of drawers. Here, she said, handing it to him. At least dry your face and hands. Would you like some coffee? The water's hot. Wyatt accepted the towel with a grateful nod. Coffee would be welcome, thank you. As Grace prepared the coffee, Wyatt moved to stand by the stove, the heat drawing steam from his damp clothing. Outside, lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the small cabin. Storm's right on top of us, Wyatt observed, accepting the cup of coffee Grace handed him. Might be best if I waited out a bit before heading back to the main house. Of course, Grace agreed, pouring a cup for herself. Please sit down. They settled at the small table, the storm raging around them, creating an intimate atmosphere in the lamp-lit cabin. For a while, they sipped their coffee in companionable silence, the rain drumming on the roof and the occasional rumble of thunder the only sounds. "About what happened in town," Wyatt said finally, setting his cup down. "Are you truly afraid of Thomas?" Grace considered the question, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Not afraid for my safety exactly," she said slowly. "More afraid of being pulled back into his world. Thomas has a way about him, a charm, a persuasiveness. He can make the most outlandish schemes sound reasonable, the most selfish action seem justified." She looked up, meeting Wyatt's steady gaze. "For years, I allowed him to make decisions for us, to lead us into situations that part of me knew were unwise. Coming west was one of them. I knew in my heart that Thomas wasn't cut out for the hard work of mining, that his dreams of quick riches were just that, dreams. But I followed him anyway because that's what a wife does." "Not all husbands expect blind obedience," Wyatt observed quietly. "No," Grace agreed, "but Thomas did. And I gave it to him until he sold me to pay his debts. That was the one line I couldn't cross, even for him." Wyatt was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "What would you do if he came here?" he asked finally. "If he demanded you return to him?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Grace wasn't sure she was ready to face. "I don't know," she admitted. "Legally, he's still my husband. But in every way that matters, our marriage ended the moment he put me up as collateral for his debts." "The law isn't always just," Wyatt said, a hint of bitterness in his voice. "But it is the law. If he comes with the sheriff claiming you as his wife—" "Then I'll tell the sheriff exactly what Thomas did," Grace said, a spark of defiance igniting within her. "I'll show him the papers from the auction and your statement freeing me, and if that's not enough—" She faltered, the momentary courage fading. "If that's not enough, we'll find another way," Wyatt finished for her, his voice firm. "I won't let you be taken against your will, Grace. Not by Thomas, not by anyone." The conviction in his voice sent a warmth spreading through Grace that had nothing to do with the coffee or the heat from the stove. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing within her over the past month, feelings for this quiet, honorable man who had saved her in more ways than one. "Thank you," she said softly, unable to express the full depth of her gratitude and the other emotions swirling within her. Wyatt seemed about to say more when another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, followed by a crash of thunder so loud that Grace jumped. The storm was passing directly overhead now, the rain a constant roar on the cabin roof. "I should probably head back to the main house before it gets worse," Wyatt said, though he made no move to leave. "Though it's hard to imagine how it could get much worse than this." As if in answer to his words, the rain suddenly intensified, beating against the windows with such force that Grace feared the glass might break. A gust of wind howled around the cabin, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. "You can't go out in that," Grace said decisively. "You'll be soaked through before you reach the main house. Stay until the worst passes." Wyatt hesitated, clearly torn between practicality and propriety. "Are you sure? I don't want to compromise your reputation." Grace almost smiled at his concern. "My reputation is already in tatters, I'm afraid. A woman sold at auction doesn't have much standing to lose." "You have standing with me," Wyatt said quietly, "and with anyone else whose opinion matters." The simple statement touched Grace deeply. "Thank you for that," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "But truly, I'm not concerned about appearances. Stay until the rain eases." Wyatt nodded his agreement, and Grace poured them both more coffee. The storm continued to rage outside, keeping them confined to the small cabin as evening deepened into night. They talked of many things as they waited, of books they had read, of places they had seen, of dreams they still harbored. Grace found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, unburdening herself of thoughts and feelings she had kept locked away during her marriage to Thomas. Wyatt listened with genuine interest, offering his own perspectives without judgment or criticism. It was a kind of conversation Grace had almost forgotten could exist between a man and a woman, equal, respectful, enriching. As midnight approached, the storm finally began to abate, the thunder moving off into the distance and the rain softening to a gentle patter. Wyatt rose from his chair, stretching slightly after the hours of sitting. "I should go," he said, reaching for his hat, which had dried somewhat during their conversation. "Thank you for the coffee and the company." "Thank you for staying," Grace replied, rising as well. "It was nice not to be alone during the storm." They stood facing each other in the small space, an unspoken current passing between them. For a brief, breathless moment, Grace thought Wyatt might step closer, might even kiss her, but he merely placed his hat on his head and moved to the door. "Good night, Grace," he said softly. "Sleep well." "Good night, Wyatt," she replied, watching as he stepped out into the damp night, the door closing quietly behind him. Grace moved to the window, watching his tall figure make its way through the dripping trees toward the main house. Only when the light appeared in his window did she turn away, a mixture of relief and disappointment stirring within her. She was falling in love with Wyatt Jackson. The realization came with perfect clarity as she prepared for bed, extinguishing the lamps and banking the fire in the stove. It wasn't a sudden, overwhelming passion like what she had felt for Thomas in the beginning, but something deeper, steadier, a recognition of kindred spirits, a profound appreciation for his character and gentle strength. But she was still married to another man, still bound by vows she had made before God and witnesses. Until that situation was resolved one way or another, she would not act on her feelings for Wyatt. With that resolution firm in her mind, Grace climbed into bed, listening to the soft patter of rain on the roof as she drifted into sleep. The following week passed without incident, the routine of ranch life reasserting itself after the disruption of the trip to Silver City. Grace threw herself into her work with renewed vigor, partly to keep her mind occupied and partly out of a desire to be truly useful to Wyatt. She began a vegetable garden behind the main house, turning the soil and planting seeds she had purchased in town. Wyatt helped her build a fence to keep out rabbits and deer, working alongside her in the cool morning hours before heading out to tend the cattle. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch of the main house, watching the sunset and talking of the day's events. Sometimes they would read aloud to each other from one of Wyatt's books, poetry, mostly, or historical accounts of the West. These quiet moments became precious to Grace, storing them in her heart against the uncertainty of the future. It was during one such evening, almost 2 weeks after their encounter with Lowell in Silver City, that they saw the riders approaching. 3 men on horseback, silhouetted against the setting sun as they made their way up the valley toward the ranch. Wyatt rose from his chair, his body tense as he watched their approach. "Stay here," he said to Grace, his voice low and serious. "I'll see what they want." Grace nodded, but as soon as Wyatt had descended the porch steps to meet the riders in the yard, she moved to the edge of the porch, unwilling to hide inside when her fate might be at stake. The riders drew closer, and with a sickening lurch in her stomach, Grace recognized the man in the lead, Thomas Zimmerman, as handsome and well-dressed as ever, looking for all the world like a successful businessman rather than a man who had abandoned his wife to slavery. Beside him rode Edgar Lowell, a smug expression on his ferret-like face. The third man was a stranger to Grace, older and more weathered than the other two, with a star pinned to his vest, the sheriff of Silver City, she guessed. Wyatt stood waiting in the yard, his stance relaxed but alert, one hand resting near the holster at his hip. Ranger had appeared from somewhere and now stood at his master's side, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Evening, gentlemen," Wyatt called as the riders came to a halt a few yards away. "What brings you to Pine Shadow Ranch?" Thomas's gaze swept past Wyatt, finding Grace on the porch. A smile that didn't reach his eyes spread across his handsome face. "Why, I've come for my wife, of course," he replied loudly. "It seems she's been misplaced." Wyatt's expression didn't change, though Grace could see the tension in his shoulders. "No one's been misplaced here," he said evenly. "Mrs. Zimmerman is employed at this ranch of her own free will." Thomas dismounted, handing his reins to Lowell with a casual flick of his wrist. "Is that what she told you?" he asked, his tone conversational but with an edge beneath it. "My wife has always had a vivid imagination. The truth is, she ran away after a little disagreement. I've been searching for her for weeks." "That's not true," Grace said, unable to remain silent any longer. She descended the porch steps to stand beside Wyatt, drawing strength from his solid presence. "You abandoned me, Thomas. You left me to be sold to cover your gambling debts." Thomas had the audacity to look wounded. "Is that what they told you? Oh, my dear, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I never abandoned you. I was away on business trying to secure funds to pay our debts. When I returned and found you gone, I was frantic." The lies flowed so smoothly from his lips that for a moment Grace almost doubted her own memory. This was Thomas's greatest skill, the ability to rewrite reality to suit his purposes, to make black seem white and wrong seem right. "There was no misunderstanding," she said firmly. "You signed papers putting me up as collateral for your debts. When you couldn't pay, they took me. I was sold at auction, Thomas, like a piece of property." The third rider, the man with the sheriff's star, spoke for the first time. "That true, Zimmerman? You signed papers using your wife as collateral?" Thomas's smile faltered slightly. "There may have been some documents I signed during a difficult financial period, but I never intended for Grace to be sold. That was a gross misinterpretation of the terms." "Intent doesn't matter," Wyatt said, his voice hard. "What matters is what happened. Mrs. Zimmerman was put up for auction. I was there. I bought her freedom." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the papers from the auction, handing them to the sheriff. "See for yourself. The sale was legal, as was my decision to free her. Mrs. Zimmerman is under no obligation to anyone, least of all the man who treated her so shamefully." The sheriff examined the papers, his weathered face grave. "These appear to be in order," he acknowledged, "but there's still the matter of marriage. In the eyes of the law, a wife belongs with her husband." "Unless the husband has forfeited his rights through abandonment or cruelty," Wyatt countered, "which I'd say selling your wife at auction qualifies as." Thomas took a step forward, his charm giving way to anger. "This is absurd. Grace is my wife. She took vows to obey me, to stay by my side until death. Whatever happened, those vows still stand." He turned his attention to Grace, his expression softening into the one he had always used when trying to persuade her to his way of thinking. "Come home, Grace. All is forgiven. I've secured new investments, better ones this time. We can start fresh, just the two of us." Grace felt a familiar pull, the desire to believe him, to trust that this time would be different. But then she remembered the auction block, the humiliation of being examined like livestock, the terror of not knowing what fate awaited her. And she remembered the past month at Pine Shadow Ranch, the peace she had found, the respect she had been shown, the quiet moments with Wyatt that had begun to heal her broken spirit. "No, Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I'm not going anywhere with you. Our marriage ended the moment you put my life and freedom at risk for your debts." Thomas's face hardened, all pretense of affection vanishing. "You don't have a choice," he snarled. "Sheriff, I demand you enforce the law. This man has taken my wife against her will." The sheriff looked uncomfortable, caught between competing principles of law and justice. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he said finally, "do you wish to return to your husband?" "No," Grace replied without hesitation. "I do not." "She's confused," Thomas insisted. "She doesn't know what she's saying." "This man," he added, gesturing dismissively at Wyatt, "has obviously turned her against me." "Mrs. Zimmerman seems quite clear on what she wants," the sheriff observed. "And these papers do indicate she was legally sold and then freed. It's a complicated situation, Mr. Zimmerman." "It's not complicated at all," Thomas snapped. "She's my wife. The law is on my side." "The law also says a man can't sell another human being," Wyatt pointed out quietly. "Yet that's exactly what you did." Thomas's face flushed with anger. "I did no such thing." "It was a misunderstanding, a mistake made by overzealous creditors." "Creditors you chose to do business with," Grace interjected. "Creditors you signed papers with, putting me up as collateral. That was no mistake, Thomas. That was a deliberate choice." The sheriff cleared his throat. "I think this is a matter that needs to be settled by a judge, not here in a ranch yard. Mr. Zimmerman, I suggest you return to Silver City and consult with a lawyer." "Mrs. Zimmerman," he added, turning to Grace, "you have the right to remain here for now, but I would advise you to seek legal counsel as well." Thomas looked as though he wanted to argue further, but something in the sheriff's expression stopped him. "Fine," he said tightly, "but this isn't over, Grace. You're still my wife, and I will have you back." He turned on his heel and strode back to his horse, mounting in one fluid motion. "I'll be back," he called, his gaze moving from Grace to Wyatt, "with the law fully on my side." With that, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, Lowell scrambling to follow. The sheriff lingered a moment longer, his expression troubled. "I meant what I said about consulting a lawyer, Mrs. Zimmerman," he advised. "Your husband has a legal claim on you, regardless of what happened with the auction. You do well to protect yourself." "Thank you, Sheriff," Grace replied. "I'll do that." The sheriff nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and followed after Thomas and Lowell at a more sedate pace. When they were alone again, Grace felt her knees weaken as the tension of the confrontation drained away. Wyatt's arm came around her waist, supporting her as he guided her back to the porch steps where they both sat down. "You did well," he told her quietly, "standing up to him like that." Grace shook her head. "He'll be back," she said, the certainty heavy in her chest. "Thomas doesn't give up when he wants something, and now it's a matter of pride for him. He won't let another man take what he considers his." Wyatt's expression darkened. "You're not a thing to be taken," he said, an edge to his voice she had rarely heard. "You're a person with the right to make your own choices." "The law may not see it that way," Grace reminded him. "As the sheriff said, in the eyes of the law, I still belong to Thomas." "Then we'll fight the law," Wyatt said simply. "Or find a way around it. I meant what I said, Grace. I won't let anyone take you against your will." The fierce protectiveness in his voice warmed her, even as she worried about the complications his stance might bring. "I don't want to cause trouble for you," she said. "You've already done so much." "You're not causing trouble," Wyatt insisted. "And I haven't done anything I wouldn't do again in a heartbeat." They sat in silence for a time, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. The encounter with Thomas had changed things between them, bringing feelings to the surface that could no longer be easily denied or ignored. "I should go to my cabin," Grace said finally, rising from the step. "It's getting late." Wyatt stood as well. "I'll walk you," he offered, "just to be safe." The path to Grace's cabin was silvered by moonlight, the shadows of the pines creating patterns on the ground before them. They walked in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. At the door to her cabin, Grace turned to face Wyatt. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing with me today, for everything." "Always," Wyatt replied, the single word carrying a weight of promise. For a moment they stood looking at each other in the moonlight, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Wyatt took a step back, breaking the spell. "Get some rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Grace nodded, though sleep seemed unlikely after the day's events. "Good night, Wyatt." "Good night, Grace." She watched him walk back toward the main house, his tall figure soon swallowed by the shadows of the pines. Only when he was out of sight did she enter her cabin, closing the door on the moonlit night and the complicated emotions it had witnessed. The following days were tense with waiting, each sound of approaching riders causing Grace's heart to race with fear that Thomas had returned. Wyatt began carrying his rifle with him when he went out to check the cattle, and Ranger seemed to sense the tension, staying close to the main house instead of following Wyatt as he usually did. Grace threw herself into her work, cleaning the main house from top to bottom, tending her nascent garden, and preparing elaborate meals that neither she nor Wyatt had much appetite for. At night, she lay awake in her cabin, listening for sounds of approach, her mind racing with worries about what Thomas might do next. A week after Thomas's visit, Wyatt announced he needed to go into Silver City on business. "I've arranged for Miguel and his brother to come stay at the ranch while I'm gone," he told Grace over breakfast. "They'll keep an eye on things, make sure you're safe." Grace set down her coffee cup with a frown. "What business do you have in Silver City?" Wyatt hesitated, then met her gaze directly. "I'm going to see a lawyer about your situation." "My situation," Grace repeated, surprise evident in her voice. "But it's not your responsibility to—" "I know it's not my responsibility," Wyatt interrupted gently, "but I want to help. And the truth is, I have a personal interest in seeing you free of Thomas Zimmerman." The implication behind his words hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to address it directly. "Will you be gone long?" Grace asked instead. "Just overnight," Wyatt assured her. "I'll ride out as soon as Miguel arrives, and I should be back by tomorrow evening at the latest." Grace nodded, trying to ignore the anxiety that gripped her at the thought of Wyatt being away, even for a day. "Be careful," she said softly. "Thomas can be unpredictable when he feels challenged." "I'll keep my eyes open," Wyatt promised. Miguel and his brother, Carlos, arrived mid-morning, their easy banter and obvious respect for Wyatt somewhat easing Grace's concerns. They were both young men in their 20s, with friendly smiles and a competent air about them that suggested they knew their way around a ranch. "Mrs. Zimmerman is in charge while I'm gone," Wyatt told them firmly. "Whatever she needs, you provide." "Of course, Mr. Jackson," Miguel agreed readily. "We will take good care of the ranch and the lady." With that assurance, Wyatt prepared to depart. Grace walked with him to where sundown waited, saddled and ready for the journey. "I've left my pistol on the shelf by the door," Wyatt told her quietly as he checked the saddle straps. "It's loaded and ready just in case. Miguel and Carlos are good men, but I'd feel better knowing you had protection of your own." Grace nodded, touched by his concern. "I doubt I'll need it, but thank you." Wyatt mounted Sundown, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart skip a beat. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he promised. "Try not to worry." "I'll try," Grace agreed, knowing it was a promise she was unlikely to keep. With a final nod, Wyatt turned sundown toward the trail that led to Silver City and rode away, leaving Grace standing in the yard with a sense of foreboding she couldn't quite shake. The day passed slowly, with Grace keeping busy in the house while Miguel and Carlos tended to the ranch chores. They were respectful and kept their distance, clearly taking Wyatt's instructions to heart. In the evening, they ate the meal Grace prepared for them at the bunkhouse table, thanking her politely before retiring to the small building where ranch hands usually stayed. Grace returned to her cabin earlier than usual, the main house feeling empty without Wyatt's presence. She lit the lamps and stove, then settled in a chair with one of the books from Wyatt's library, a volume of Tennyson's poetry that had become a favorite. She was deep in The Lady of Shalott when a noise outside made her look up, a scraping sound like a boot on the porch steps, then silence. "Miguel," she called, setting the book aside. "Carlos." No response came, but the hair on the back of her neck prickled with the certainty that someone was out there. Grace moved quietly to the door, placing her ear against the wood to listen. Nothing. She was about to return to her chair, dismissing the sound as imagination or perhaps a raccoon investigating the porch, when there was a loud crash as the door burst open, the lock splintering under the force of a heavy boot. Thomas stood in the doorway, his handsome face twisted with fury and something else, a wild, desperate look that sent ice through Grace's veins. "Hello, wife," he said, stepping into the cabin and closing the broken door behind him. "Sorry about the entrance, but I didn't think you'd invite me in." Grace backed away, putting the table between them. "What have you done to Miguel and Carlos?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Thomas waved a dismissive hand. "Nothing permanent. A bump on the head for the younger one and the other took off running. Not very loyal, your protectors." He looked around the cabin with a sneer. "So this is where he's keeping you. Cozy little love nest, isn't it?" "It's not like that," Grace protested. "I work for Mr. Jackson. I'm his housekeeper." Thomas laughed, the sound harsh and without humor. "Is that what you call it? Do you really expect me to believe that a man like Jackson paid good money for you at auction just to have you cook his meals and sweep his floors?" "It's the truth," Grace insisted. "He bought my freedom, not my body." "How noble," Thomas mocked. "And I suppose you've been a perfect lady the whole time you've been here. Never once shared his bed." Grace felt her cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. "Never," she said firmly. "Mr. Jackson is a gentleman, which is more than I can say for you." Thomas's expression darkened. "Watch your tongue, Grace. I'm still your husband, and I'm tired of this farce. You're coming with me. Now." He took a step toward her, and Grace backed away further, her mind racing. The pistol Wyatt had mentioned was in the main house, too far to reach. There was a kitchen knife on the counter behind her, but she wasn't sure she could get to it before Thomas grabbed her. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, keeping her voice as calm as possible. "The sheriff said this matter needs to be settled by a judge. Let's do that properly, Thomas." "Through the courts." "The courts take time," Thomas replied, taking another step toward her. "And I'm not a patient man, as you well know. Besides, the law is clear: a wife belongs with her husband." "A husband who sells his wife at auction forfeits his rights," Grace countered, edging sideways toward the counter and the knife. Thomas's face contorted with rage. "I didn't sell you," he shouted. "It was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Why won't you believe me?" "Because I was there," Grace replied, her own anger rising to match his. "I was the one standing on that auction block, wearing your ring, while men bid on me like I was a piece of furniture. Where were you then, Thomas? Where were you when I needed you most?" For a moment, something like shame crossed Thomas's face, quickly replaced by defensive fury. "I came back for you as soon as I could. I've been searching for weeks, and what do I find? My wife playing house with another man, turning against me, refusing to honor her vows. What about your vows? Grace demanded. To love and protect me. Was selling me protection, Thomas. Was abandoning me love. Enough. Thomas lunged forward, grabbing her arm in a bruising grip. We're leaving, now. I've got horses waiting. Grace struggled against his hold, twisting and pulling with all her might. Let me go, she cried, her free hand searching blindly behind her for anything she could use as a weapon. Her fingers closed around the handle of the knife just as Thomas yanked her toward him, throwing her off balance. They struggled, Grace trying to bring the knife into play while Thomas attempted to subdue her. In the confusion, the knife slipped, slicing across Thomas's forearm. He yelled in pain and surprise, releasing her to clutch at the wound. You cut me, he exclaimed, looking at the blood seeping between his fingers with disbelief. Grace backed away, the knife held before her in a trembling hand. I didn't mean to, she said, shocked by what had happened. But I will not go with you, Thomas. I would rather die. The cold determination in her voice seemed to penetrate Thomas's anger. He stared at her as though seeing her for the first time not as his property, but as a woman with a will of her own. You've changed, he said accusingly. The Grace I married would never have raised a hand against me. The Grace you married died on that auction block, she replied steadily. The woman standing before you now knows her own worth, and it's considerably more than you ever placed on me. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of horses approaching at a gallop reached them. Grace's heart leaped with hope. Wyatt had returned early, or perhaps Miguel had found help. Thomas heard it too, his expression turning calculating. This isn't over, he warned, wrapping a handkerchief around his bleeding arm. I'll be back with more men next time, and I won't be so gentle. With that threat hanging in the air, he wrenched open the damaged door and disappeared into the night, leaving Grace alone with the knife still clutched in her shaking hand. Moments later, she heard a shout from outside, Wyatt's voice, calling her name with urgency and fear. She dropped the knife and rushed to the door, relief washing over her at the sight of him dismounting from sundown, his face taut with concern. Grace, he exclaimed, taking in her disheveled appearance and the broken door. Are you hurt? What happened? Thomas was here, she managed to say before her legs gave way beneath her, the aftermath of fear and adrenaline taking its toll. Wyatt caught her before she could fall, his strong arms lifting her as though she weighed nothing. He carried her to the chair and set her down gently, kneeling before her to examine her for injuries. Did he hurt you? He asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger as he noted the bruise forming on her arm where Thomas had grabbed her. Not really, Grace assured him, though her arm throbbed painfully. But he tried to take me away. I fought him. I cut him with a knife, not deeply, but he was bleeding. Wyatt's expression was grim. Good, he said simply. Where is he now? He ran when he heard horses coming, Grace explained. He threatened to return with more men. Wyatt nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. I thought he might try something like this when he heard I'd gone to town. That's why I came back early. He looked around the cabin, taking in the signs of struggle. You can't stay here tonight, not with the door broken. You'll come to the main house. Grace didn't argue, the thought of spending the night alone in the cabin with its damaged door far from appealing. What about Miguel and Carlos? She asked as Wyatt helped her to her feet. I found Miguel on my way and he was just regaining consciousness, Wyatt told her. Thomas hit him from behind. Carlos apparently went for help, but we must have missed each other on the trail. He kept his arm around her waist as they left the cabin, supporting her still shaky legs as they walked to the main house. Inside, Wyatt led her to the sofa near the fireplace and gently seated her there. I'll check on Miguel, then come back and fix that door, he said. Will you be all right here for a few minutes? Grace nodded, drawing a blanket around her shoulders. "I'll be fine. Just don't be long." Wyatt's expression softened as he looked down at her. "I won't," he promised, then hesitated a moment before leaning down to press a kiss to her forehead, a brief, gentle touch that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her. "You're safe now." While Wyatt was gone, Grace tried to collect her thoughts, to make sense of the tumultuous emotions the evening had stirred. The fear she had felt when Thomas burst into her cabin was still with her, but it was overshadowed by a newfound strength. She had stood up to him, had defended herself, had refused to be cowed by his threats or manipulated by his accusations. And then there was Wyatt, his concern for her, his protection, the kiss he had placed on her forehead. The feelings she had been trying to keep in check were becoming harder to deny, especially in the wake of Thomas's accusation. No, she had never shared Wyatt's bed, but that didn't mean she hadn't thought about it, hadn't wondered what it would be like to be held by him, to be loved by a man who treated her with respect and gentleness. Wyatt returned sooner than she expected, his expression relieved. "Miguel's going to be fine," he reported. "Just a nasty bump on the head. I've settled him in the bunkhouse and told him to rest. I'll fix your cabin door in the morning, but for tonight—" "For tonight," Grace prompted when he trailed off. "For tonight you should take my room," Wyatt continued. "I'll sleep out here on the sofa, close to the door in case Thomas decides to come back." Grace shook her head. "I can't take your bed, Wyatt. The sofa will be fine for me." "I insist," Wyatt said firmly. "After what you've been through, you need proper rest. Besides, I've slept in far worse places than this comfortable sofa." Seeing the determination in his face, Grace relented. "All right," she agreed. "Thank you." After showing her to his room, Wyatt left her to prepare for bed, promising to be just outside if she needed anything. The room was simply furnished but comfortable. The large bed covered with a patchwork quilt that Grace recognized as likely being made by Wyatt's mother. As she slipped between the sheets, she caught the scent of Wyatt on the pillow, a clean, masculine smell that was oddly comforting. Despite the events of the evening, she found herself drifting off to sleep almost immediately. The sense of safety Wyatt's proximity provided, allowing her body and mind to finally relax. She awoke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, she was disoriented, then remembered the events of the previous night and why she was in Wyatt's bed. Dressing quickly in the clothes she had worn the day before, Grace made her way to the kitchen, where she found Wyatt preparing a simple breakfast of bacon and biscuits. "Good morning," he greeted her, his eyes warming at the sight of her. "How did you sleep?" "Surprisingly well," Grace admitted, moving to help him with the breakfast preparations. "Any sign of Thomas or his men?" Wyatt shook his head. "Nothing. Carlos came back around dawn with 2 friends from the neighboring ranch, but all's been quiet. I've posted them as lookouts just in case." They worked together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, setting the table and finishing the cooking. It wasn't until they were seated across from each other, coffee and food before them, that Wyatt broached the subject that was clearly on his mind. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said, his expression serious. "Thomas isn't going to give up easily, especially now that you've wounded both his pride and his arm." Grace nodded, her appetite diminishing at the thought. "What did the lawyer in Silver City say? Is there any legal way for me to be free of him?" Wyatt sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "It's complicated. The lawyer I spoke with thinks we might have a case based on abandonment and cruelty, but it would be a long, difficult process. Divorce isn't easily granted in these parts, especially against a husband's wishes." "Then what can I do?" Grace asked, her heart sinking. I can't live like this, Wyatt, always looking over my shoulder, afraid Thomas will appear and try to drag me away. Wyatt was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on his coffee cup. There is one other option, he said finally, his voice unusually hesitant, but I'm not sure if it's one you'd consider. What option? Grace prompted when he didn't continue. Wyatt looked up, meeting her eyes directly. Marriage, he said simply. To me. Grace stared at him, certain she had misheard. Marriage, but I'm already married, that's the whole problem. Not necessarily, Wyatt explained. The lawyer I spoke with mentioned a legal concept called wife sale. It's an old practice, not common anymore, but still recognized in some jurisdictions. When a husband sells his wife at public auction, with her wearing her wedding ring to symbolize the transfer of marriage rights, it can be considered a form of divorce. The new owner can then marry the woman if both parties consent. Grace absorbed this information slowly, her mind whirling with implications. Are you saying that when Thomas put me up for auction and you bought me, it might be considered a legal transfer of marriage rights? Wyatt confirmed. Especially since you were wearing your wedding ring at the time, which is a key element of the tradition. The lawyer thinks we have a strong case, particularly given Thomas's subsequent abandonment and your clear opposition to returning to him. And you're proposing marriage to me? Grace asked, still struggling to believe what she was hearing. Wyatt set down his coffee cup and reached across the table to take her hand in his. I am, he said, his voice steady though she could see nervousness in his eyes. Not just as a legal strategy, though that's part of it. The truth is, Grace, I've come to care for you deeply. More than I thought possible after Rebecca. He squeezed her hand gently. I'm not asking for your love in return, not right away, but I am offering you a life here as my wife in name and in fact if that's what you want. A partnership based on mutual respect and, I hope, growing affection. And if that's not what you want, if you'd prefer to remain as you are, working for me while we fight Thomas through the courts, I'll respect that decision too. Grace sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by Wyatt's words and the emotions they stirred within her. Marriage to Wyatt, it was a solution she hadn't considered, hadn't allowed herself to consider given her legal ties to Thomas. But if what the lawyer said was true, if she was already technically divorced through the wife sale tradition. I don't know what to say, she admitted finally. It's so sudden. You don't have to answer now, Wyatt assured her, releasing her hand. Take time to think about it. It's a big decision and I want you to be sure. Grace nodded, grateful for his understanding. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. For caring enough to offer me this choice. Wyatt smiled, a tender expression that made her heart skip a beat. You're worth caring for, Grace, worth fighting for. I just want you to be happy and safe, whether that's as my wife or not. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of tension. Not the fear of Thomas's return, though that remained a concern, but the awareness of the decision Grace needed to make. Wyatt, true to his word, gave her space to think, never pressing for an answer, though she caught him watching her sometimes with a look of such longing that it took her breath away. The cabin door was repaired, stronger than before, but Grace continued to sleep in the main house, taking the small room Wyatt had cleared of storage items and turned into a proper guest chamber. It seemed safer that way, and neither of them mentioned the possibility of her returning to the isolated cabin. A week after Wyatt's proposal, Grace was in the garden, harvesting early lettuce and radishes for the evening meal, when she heard the sound of approaching riders. Her heart quickened with fear, until she recognized the sheriff of Silver City among the three men making their way up to the main house. Wyatt, who had been mending a fence nearby, dropped his tools and moved to intercept the riders, positioning himself between them and Grace in a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed. "Sheriff," he called in greeting as the men dismounted. "What brings you back to Pine Shadow Ranch?" The sheriff removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow before responding. "Legal matters, I'm afraid, Mr. Jackson. I have papers here regarding Mrs. Zimmerman's situation." Grace set down her basket of vegetables and joined Wyatt, her stomach knotting with anxiety. "What papers?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Court summons," the sheriff replied, pulling a folded document from his vest pocket. "Mr. Zimmerman has filed a formal complaint, claiming you've been kept from him against your will. The judge wants to see both of you in his chambers day after tomorrow to sort it all out." He handed the paper to Grace, who took it with trembling fingers. "Will I have to go with Thomas after the hearing?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "That's for the judge to decide," the sheriff said, his expression sympathetic but non-committal. "But I'd advise you to bring any evidence you have regarding your claims of abandonment and unusual treatment." Wyatt's jaw tightened visibly. "We'll be there," he assured the sheriff, "with all the relevant documentation." After the sheriff and his deputies had departed, Grace and Wyatt retreated to the main house to discuss this new development. The summons lay on the table between them, its official seal seeming to mock their hopes for a peaceful resolution. "What do you think will happen?" Grace asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. Wyatt considered the question carefully. "It depends on the judge," he said finally. "Some would side with Thomas automatically simply because he's your husband. Others might be more willing to consider the unusual circumstances." He reached across the table to take her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, I won't let him take you, Grace. Even if we have to leave here, start fresh somewhere else." The loyalty in his voice, the unwavering support, stirred something deep within Grace, a certainty she had been moving toward for days. "Wyatt," she said softly, turning her hand to clasp his, "I've been thinking about your proposal." His expression remained carefully neutral, though she could see the hope that flickered in his eyes. And I would be honored to be your wife," Grace replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Not just as a legal strategy against Thomas, but because I've come to care for you too." Deeply. The joy that spread across Wyatt's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual at first, then blazing with undeniable brilliance. "Do you mean it?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I do," Grace confirmed, smiling through the tears that had begun to gather in her eyes. "I think I've known for weeks, but I was afraid to admit it, even to myself. With Thomas still legally my husband, it seemed wrong to acknowledge my feelings for you." Wyatt rose from his chair and came around the table, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. "Grace," he murmured, his hands gentle as they framed her face. "May I kiss you?" In answer, Grace lifted her face to his, her eyes closing as his lips met hers in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they might build together if fate and the law allowed. When they finally parted, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her cheek. "If we're to present ourselves as married before the judge," he said, "we should make it official beforehand. There's a minister in Silver City who might be willing to perform the ceremony if we explain the circumstances." Grace nodded, her heart racing at the thought. "When?" "Tomorrow," Wyatt suggested. "We can ride into town early, find the minister, be married by noon. Then face the judge together the following day." The plan was simple, direct, and thoroughly in keeping with Wyatt's character. Grace found herself smiling, the fear that had gripped her since the sheriff's arrival receding in the face of this new hope. "Tomorrow, then," she agreed. "Though I have nothing suitable to wear for a wedding." Wyatt laughed softly, the sound vibrating through his chest where she rested against him. "Wear that blue dress you made from the fabric we bought in town. You look beautiful in it." "You noticed?" Grace asked, surprised by his observation. "I notice everything about you," Wyatt admitted, his arms tightening around her. "The way the sun catches in your hair when you're working in the garden, the little furrow between your brows when you're concentrating on a book, the gentle way you speak to Ranger when you think no one's listening." The words touched Grace deeply, all the more so because they reflected the same quiet attention she had paid to him over the past months, noticing his habits, his preferences, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "I love you, Wyatt Jackson," she said, the words coming easily now that she had allowed herself to recognize the truth. "And I love you, Grace," he replied, sealing the declaration with another kiss that left her breathless and certain of her decision. They were married the following day in the small church in Silver City, with only the minister and his wife as witnesses. Grace wore the blue dress Wyatt had mentioned, with wildflowers he had picked that morning arranged in her hair. Wyatt wore his best shirt and vest, his boots polished to a shine for the occasion. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows taking on new significance given the journey that had brought them to this moment. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Wyatt kissed her before God and the sparse congregation, Grace felt a sense of rightness, of coming home, that she had never experienced in her first marriage. They spent the night at the hotel in Silver City, their wedding night both tender and passionate as they discovered each other as husband and wife. In the quiet aftermath, lying in Wyatt's arms with her head on his chest, Grace found herself tracing the scar that ran along his jawline. "How did you get this?" she asked softly. Wyatt captured her hand and brought it to his lips. "Gettysburg," he replied. "Confederate cavalryman with a saber. I was lucky he was aiming for my throat." Grace shuddered at the thought of how close she had come to never knowing this man, this love. "I'm glad you survived," she whispered. "So am I," Wyatt agreed, his arms tightening around her. "Though I didn't always feel that way, especially right after the war, but now, with you, I understand why I was spared." They lay in comfortable silence for a time, until Wyatt spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "No matter what happens tomorrow with the judge, I want you to know that I meant every word of my vows today. You are my wife in every way that matters to me, legal technicalities aside." "And you are my husband," Grace replied firmly, "the only one I acknowledge or ever will again." With that assurance between them, they drifted off to sleep, drawing strength from each other for the confrontation that awaited them in the morning. The judge's chambers were wood-paneled and austere, the smell of tobacco and leather permeating the air. Judge Henry Blackwell, a stern-faced man with piercing gray eyes and a reputation for fair but strict interpretation of the law, sat behind a massive desk, reviewing the papers before him with a furrowed brow. Thomas and his lawyer, a slick-looking individual with a gold watch chain prominently displayed across his vest, sat on one side of the room. Wyatt and Grace, with the lawyer Wyatt had consulted, occupied the other side. The tension in the air was palpable, thickening with each tick of the large clock on the wall. "I've reviewed the complaint filed by Mr. Zimmerman," Judge Blackwell said finally, looking up from the papers, "and the response submitted by Mrs. Zimmerman and Mr. Jackson. This is an unusual case, to say the least." He fixed Thomas with a hard stare. "Mr. Zimmerman, you claim your wife was taken from you against her will, yet there are documented reports that you placed her as collateral for gambling debts, resulting in her being sold at public auction. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Thomas leaned forward, his expression earnest and aggrieved. A terrible misunderstanding, Your Honor. I never intended for my wife to be sold. The creditors overstepped their authority in my absence. When I returned and discovered what had happened, I was devastated. Yet you made no immediate effort to legal recourse, the judge observed dryly. Instead, you attempted to forcibly remove Mrs. Zimmerman from her place of employment some weeks later. Thomas's lawyer intervened smoothly. My client was overcome with emotion at finding his wife, Your Honor. He reacted as any husband might when discovering his beloved spouse had been taken in by another man. Judge Blackwell's eyebrows rose skeptically. Taken in. According to these statements, he tapped a document before him, Mr. Jackson purchased Mrs. Zimmerman's freedom at the auction, then employed her as housekeeper at his ranch, providing separate living quarters and proper wages. So they claim, Thomas's lawyer countered. But we have only their word for that arrangement. The fact remains that Mrs. Zimmerman is legally married to my client and as such is obligated to return to him. The judge turned his attention to Grace, his expression softening slightly. Mrs. Zimmerman, you claim your husband abandoned you and that you fear for your safety if returned to his custody. Can you elaborate? Grace sat up straighter, drawing courage from Wyatt's solid presence beside her. Yes, Your Honor. Thomas left me with nothing when his creditors came calling. He had signed papers using me as collateral without my knowledge or consent. When the debts came due and he couldn't pay, he disappeared, leaving me to face the consequences alone. She held up her left hand, where her wedding ring from Thomas had been until the previous day, when she had removed it before exchanging vows with Wyatt. I was sold at auction still wearing his ring, a public humiliation I would not have suffered had he honored his vows to protect me. Judge Blackwell nodded thoughtfully. And now you wish to remain with Mr. Jackson rather than return to your husband. I do not wish to return to Thomas, Grace confirmed firmly, but there is something else Your Honor should know. She glanced at Wyatt, who nodded encouragingly. Wyatt and I were married yesterday by Reverend Simmons here in Silver City. A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Thomas half rose from his chair, his face flushing with anger. That's impossible, he exclaimed. She's already married to me. Sit down, Mr. Zimmerman, the judge ordered sharply. Then, to Grace and Wyatt's lawyer. On what grounds do you claim this second marriage is valid? The lawyer, a dignified older man named Harrison, cleared his throat. Your Honor, we believe the practice known as wife sale effectively dissolved Mrs. Zimmerman's first marriage. This tradition, while uncommon now, has historical and legal precedent in both England and America. When a husband sells his wife at public auction, with the wife wearing her wedding ring to symbolize the transfer of marital rights, it constitutes a form of divorce by mutual consent. He placed several documents on the judge's desk. I've included references to legal cases where this practice was upheld, including Thompson v. Thompson in Massachusetts and the English case of Menz v. Menz. Given that Mr. Zimmerman initiated the wife's sale by putting Mrs. Zimmerman up as collateral, and that she was sold at public auction wearing his ring, we contend that her marriage to Mr. Zimmerman was effectively dissolved at that point. Judge Blackwell examined the documents with interest. A novel argument, he acknowledged, and not without some merit. The wife sale tradition does indeed have legal precedent, though it's fallen out of favor in more civilized circles. Thomas's lawyer jumped to his feet. This is absurd, Your Honor. My client never intended to divorce his wife. The auction was a mistake, not a deliberate wife sale. Intent is relevant, Judge Blackwell agreed, but so are actions. Mr. Zimmerman's actions gambling his wife away, then disappearing speak louder than his current claims of devotion. He turned to Thomas directly. Did you or did you not sign papers putting your wife up as collateral for gambling debts? Thomas shifted uncomfortably. I may have signed something in a moment of desperation, but I never thought it would come to that. I expected to win back enough to cover the debts before anyone came collecting. So you admit to gambling with your wife's freedom, the judge summarized bluntly, and then abandoning her when those gambles failed to pay off. I didn't abandon her, Thomas insisted. I went to raise more funds. By the time I returned, she was gone. The judge's expression made it clear he found this explanation lacking. Mrs. Jackson, he said, deliberately using Grace's new married name, did your first husband make any attempt to contact you after the auction? Any effort to secure your release or well-being? No, Your Honor, Grace replied truthfully. The first I saw or heard from Thomas after the auction was when he appeared at Pine Shadow Ranch with Mr. Lowell and the sheriff, demanding I return with him. Judge Blackwell nodded, making a note on the paper before him. And would you say you entered your second marriage willingly and with full understanding of the circumstances? Absolutely, Your Honor, Grace affirmed, her voice steady. Wyatt Jackson is a good, honorable man who has treated me with nothing but respect. I love him, and I entered our marriage with joy and free will. The judge considered this, then turned to Wyatt. Mr. Jackson, what led you to purchase Mrs. Zimmerman at the auction? Wyatt met the judge's gaze directly. I fought in the war, Your Honor, on the Union side. I saw too many people treated as property, and I swore if I lived through it, I'd never stand by and watch that happen again. When I saw Grace on that auction block, still wearing her wedding ring, I couldn't walk away. I bought her freedom, not her person. His voice softened as he continued. Over the months she worked at my ranch, I came to admire her strength, her intelligence, her kindness. And eventually, to love her. I asked her to marry me because I want to spend my life with her, protecting her and being protected by her, sharing whatever comes our way. The simple sincerity of Wyatt's words hung in the air, contrasting sharply with Thomas's calculated explanations and excuses. Judge Blackwell studied the two men thoughtfully, his fingers steepled before him. This is indeed an unusual case, he said finally. On the one hand, we have a legal marriage that, under normal circumstances, would take precedence. On the other hand, we have actions by the first husband that could reasonably be construed as forfeiting his marital rights, followed by a second marriage entered into with good faith and clear consent. He turned to Thomas's lawyer. Do you have any further arguments to present before I make my ruling? The lawyer looked briefly panicked, clearly sensing the direction the judge was leaning. Your Honor, the sanctity of marriage is at stake here. If you rule in favor of the second marriage, you set a dangerous precedent that allows wives to abandon their husbands whenever a more appealing option presents itself. That is hardly the situation here, the judge countered dryly. Unless you consider being sold at auction an appealing option that Mrs. Jackson sought out. Turning back to the papers before him, Judge Blackwell was silent for several long moments, the ticking of the clock the only sound in the tense chamber. Finally, he looked up, his decision evident in his expression. After careful consideration of the facts and relevant precedents, I find that the actions of Thomas Zimmerman in placing his wife as collateral for gambling debts, followed by her sale at public auction while wearing her wedding ring, constituted a de facto dissolution of their marriage under the wife-sale tradition. While this practice is not one I would generally endorse in modern society, the legal precedent exists and applies in this unusual circumstance. Thomas made a sound of protest, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Furthermore, Mr. Zimmerman's subsequent abandonment, regardless of his claimed intentions, deprived him of any moral standing to now reclaim his wife against her will. The second marriage, having been entered into with good faith and full consent by both parties, is hereby recognized as valid and binding. He fixed Thomas with a stern glare. Mr. Zimmerman, I strongly advise you to accept this ruling and move on with your life. Any further attempts to interfere with Mr. and Mrs. Jackson will be viewed as harassment and dealt with accordingly. Is that understood? Thomas's face was a mask of fury and disbelief. This is outrageous, he sputtered. I'll appeal to a higher court. You'll do as the judge says, his lawyer interrupted, placing a restraining hand on his client's arm. Thank you, Your Honor. We accept your ruling. Judge Blackwell nodded, clearly unconvinced of Thomas's compliance but willing to give him the chance to depart with some dignity intact. This matter is closed, he declared, gathering the papers into a neat stack. Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, you are free to go with the court's recognition of your marriage. Good day to you all. Outside the judge's chambers, Grace clung to Wyatt's arm, hardly daring to believe their good fortune. Is it really over? She whispered. Am I truly free of him? Wyatt covered her hand with his touch warm and reassuring. It's over, he confirmed. Legally and in every other way. You're my wife now, Grace Jackson, and no one can change that. Her new name sent a thrill of joy through Grace. Grace Jackson, she repeated, savoring the sound of it. I like how that sounds. So do I, Wyatt agreed, smiling down at her with such love that her heart felt too full to contain it all. They were about to leave the courthouse when Thomas appeared before them, his face still flushed with anger. This isn't over, he hissed, glaring at Grace. You think you've won, but you haven't seen the last of me. Wyatt stepped forward, placing himself between Grace and Thomas. The judge made his ruling, he said evenly. Accept it and move on, Zimmerman. There's nothing for you here anymore. She was mine first, Thomas insisted, his voice rising. You stole her from me. No one stole me, Grace said firmly, moving to stand beside Wyatt rather than behind him. You gave me away, Thomas. You valued cards and whiskey more than your wife, and now you've lost me forever. It's time for you to accept that and leave us in peace. Something in her calm certainty seemed to penetrate Thomas's anger. He stared at her for a long moment, then at Wyatt, then back at her. You've changed, he said finally, an echo of his words in her cabin the night he had tried to take her by force. Yes, Grace agreed simply. I have. Without another word, Thomas turned and strode away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Grace watched him go, feeling not triumph or even anger anymore, but a quiet pity for the man who had never understood the true value of what he had thrown away. Let's go home, Wyatt said softly, taking her hand in his. Home. The word held new meaning now, encompassing not just Pine Shadow Ranch with its pine-covered hills and Silver Creek, but the life she and Wyatt would build there together, a life of mutual respect, shared work, and deep love. Yes, Grace agreed, squeezing his hand. Let's go home. 5 years later, Grace stood on the porch of Pine Shadow Ranch, watching as Wyatt swung their 3-year-old son, William, onto the back of a gentle pony. The boy's excited squeals carried across the yard, mingling with the laughter of his 5-year-old sister, Eleanor, who was already proudly riding her own pony in circles around the corral. Not too fast, William, Grace called, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly where their third child grew. Remember what Papa taught you about holding the reins. Wyatt looked up and caught her eye, his smile as warm and loving as it had been on their wedding day. He's doing fine, he assured her. A natural horseman just like his papa. Grace smiled back, her heart full to overflowing with the joy this life had brought her. After the judge's ruling, they had returned to Pine Shadow Ranch to begin their life together as husband and wife. The transition had been surprisingly easy, their months of working side by side having already established patterns of cooperation and mutual support that carried naturally into marriage. Thomas had never reappeared, though they heard occasional news of him through Silver City gossip. He had moved to California, apparently, still chasing dreams of quick riches in the goldfields there. Grace wished him well, her former anger having long since dissipated into indifference. Pine Shadow Ranch had prospered under their joint care. Wyatt had expanded the cattle operation, while Grace had started a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, teaching 3 days a week in the converted bunkhouse. Their own children were the joy of their lives, Alina with her father's blue eyes and determined nature, William with his mother's blonde curls and gentle spirit, and now a third child on the way, a new blessing to add to their already abundant happiness. As Wyatt finished William's riding lesson and lifted the boy down from the pony, Grace descended the porch steps to meet them. Wyatt's arm came around her waist, his hand resting protectively over hers on her belly. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice low with concern. "Not too tired from standing so long. I'm fine," Grace assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Happy to watch my men at work." Wyatt dropped a kiss on the top of her head, then bent to scoop up William, who was tugging at his pant leg. "What do you say we all go inside and have some of Mama's apple pie?" he suggested, eliciting cheers from both children. As they walked toward the house, a family united by love and choice rather than merely by law, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the humiliation of the auction block to the joy of this moment, it had been a path of both hardship and blessing. The wedding ring she had worn that day on the auction platform was long gone, replaced by the simple gold band Wyatt had placed on her finger, a symbol not of ownership but of partnership, not of subjugation but of equality. She had been sold at auction still wearing her wedding ring, and a cowboy had bought her freedom. But the true freedom, she had discovered, came not just from the legal declaration of a judge or the protective actions of a good man, but from finding the courage to claim her own worth, to make her own choices, to build a life founded on mutual respect and enduring love. As Wyatt held the door for her, his eyes warm with the love that had only deepened with the passing years, Grace stepped into their home, grateful beyond words for the auction that had seemed like an ending, but had proven to be just the beginning of the richest chapter of her life.